what I'm going to share tonight is part of, as she was alluding to, part of my larger project and part of this book. So if you are interested, I recently came out with this book called The Price of the Common Good. And what I try to do in the book, and in my work more generally, is to show how the idea of the common good is not just something that maybe we should aspire to, but it actually describes a logic of action, of cooperation that's already happening in our lives, and not just in our families or in our politics, but also in the economy. So I think we can't properly understand a modern economy and its institutions if we don't have some kind of access to the logic of the common good. And actually we don't, so we frequently misunderstand what's actually going on in a lot of economic institutions. So here's a sentence I wrote. I'm going to today primarily talk about a case study, or a particular case, the case of Uber, and the gig economy as a broader example of this. I think Uber presents a number of problems, and the gig economy more broadly presents some challenges that we won't really understand until we can speak the language of the common good. So now, what does the gig economy indicate? Well, it might seem like it indicates, or the digital economy more broadly, perhaps I should say, it might seem like in our modern digital economy, economic life is getting simpler because, thanks in part to smartphones and the internet, if I want a taxi or a pizza or a repair guy or any number of lots of other services, I just pull out my phone, I call up an app, swipe a few buttons, and in a few minutes or a few hours, I've got what I need. And not only can I do that right here, I could go to any state in the union and use the same app. I could go to, at least in the case of Uber, I could go to 70 or more countries around the world, and the same app would get me from place to place. So simple. Uber has become an enormous company by making life simple for me as a client. Currently, when I last checked, Uber's market capitalization is $200 billion. As I said, they have 4 million people who drive for them around the world. DoorDash, another big gig economy giant, his market cap is $100 billion, and they operate in all 50 states. So these gig economy firms are large in scale. And they have grown so large by simplifying my life. But I think we may have bought technical simplicity at the price of ethical complexity, so to speak. Because it's easier for me, all I need to do is know the app. And it's no longer the case that I have to go around anywhere I travel. I may have to look up what the taxi companies are, compare the ratings, try and figure out who's open at what time of day, etc. But in that more technically complex task, when I was getting a ride from a taxi, at least it was a straightforward exchange. He had a ride, I had some money, and I needed one. We exchanged, and it was easy. Things are simpler for me now. I just pull out an app. But if we open the hood, it looks like things are more ethically complex. Because what's behind there? Well, there are 60 million and more gig workers in the US, another 60 million in Europe, and I don't even know how many the worldwide statistics are. And those are the people that I'm indirectly interacting with in a mediated way when I am pulling out the Uber app. But to give an idea of the complexity, it doesn't really matter how many Ubers I've taken or I may take. It's not Uber that it's actually giving me a ride. I have never gotten a ride from Uber because Uber does not give rides. Uber and its employees do not give rides. Those 4 million drivers who drive for Uber are not employees of Uber. They are just contractors that Uber has signed a momentary tech-mediated agreement with to give me the ride that I've asked for. And so it's no longer simply a case of exchange between someone who wants to offer a ride and someone who needs a ride. We have this mediating app and this mediating giant corporation that's kind of muddying the waters. As I said, so Uber's drivers, in the US at least, are typically only independent contractors, not employees. Or at least this is how Uber sees things and how Uber wants it to be. So in 2019, California passed a law which basically had the effect of making Uber drivers employees rather than contractors. And then Uber and its allies like Lyft launched a campaign that soaked up $200 million to overturn this law and reclassify them as contractors. So unsurprisingly, they won the popular vote. They passed a constitutional amendment, or however the California process works, and so they reclassified their drivers as contractors. Now, why does Uber want it to be this way? Well, this shifts responsibility off of Uber's shoulders. If in the case of if their drivers are merely contractors, if there's some kind of accident or problem, responsibility does not fall on Uber, but on the driver. Likewise, it's the driver who has to pay for his own car, pay for his own gas, pay for his own maintenance, pay for his own insurance, pay for his own sick leave, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, although the responsibility for many aspects of the driving process falls on them, it is Uber who seems to reap a lot of the profits. I mean, Uber takes a 20 to 30% cut of any ride, and the company, as I said, on the whole is worth $200 billion in market capitalization. But perhaps as unsurprisingly, many drivers do not want to be regarded as independent contractors for exactly the same reason. That Uber is not providing them with sick leave. It's not providing them with unemployment benefits and such like. And they say, well, they're also not providing us with job security. So this is a very precarious form of work, even though we may be devoting our whole life, our whole working life, to working for Uber. And so they want to be classified as employees so that we have a dispute. Our drivers should drivers be classified as contractors or employees? Is it good for them to be contractors? Good for whom? How would we even decide? How would we weigh, for example, the convenience of the driver against Uber's productivity and profits, against the driver's moral or other claims to justice or injustice? How should we think about this issue? Now, this is sort of the tip of the iceberg of what I'm calling the Uber problem. But and the weirdness of it, I think, is because of this, the internal structure of these large digital gig economy firms and the people that they're working with. Now, but you might be thinking, of course, why should I care? I don't take Uber very much. This is not a big deal for me. I don't live in New York. I think that the Uber is just gives us a window into larger economic structures that are much bigger and much older. So consider this. Think of all the times you've walked into McDonald's, probably quite a few. It's quite possible you've never met an employee of McDonald's and never been served any food by McDonald's. Because 95% of McDonald's outlets are franchisees. So although you have dealt with somehow in some way or other with McDonald's, perhaps you have never interacted directly with them. Likewise, although I'm a big fan of the MacBook Air, I have never had a computer made by Apple, because Apple does not make any computers anymore. So they've outsourced their production of their computers to others. Look at your shoes. You probably don't own any Nike shoes and maybe have never owned any Nike shoes, because in the last 30 years, Nike hasn't made any shoes. Nike, like Apple, also outsources their production to others. Both these firms focus on design and they focus on marketing, which are a lot more profitable. And they let other people, contracted out onto the market, do the actual work or do the actual production on their behalf. So this larger outsourcing economy that we're more familiar with and has been going on for a lot longer than Uber has, displays roughly the same structure, in which tasks that apparently are controlled or done by a major brand are actually farmed out to other people. And so when you deal with the product or the company, you're dealing with a complex, back of the house structure of relationships, and it's unclear who owes what to whom. Now, I am not here to argue that outsourcing is bad, or that Uber is bad, or that the gig economy is bad. These things may conduce to economic growth. They may foster innovation, new opportunities for entrepreneurship, et cetera, et cetera. They also may not. They also may conduce to new forms of injustice and exploitation that weren't possible in older economic forms, where if you bought shoes from Nike, they were made by Nike, et cetera. Whether they are good or not, that's definitely a debate worth having. And I'm not actually here trying to solve that debate. What I'd like to do is just propose a new set of questions, a new way of asking the questions, a different way, a better way of asking the questions, rather than a set of answers. So to my mind, what we need to ask these problems, or to formulate these problems correctly and answer the questions well, is what I call the grammar of the common good, or a grammar of common good. Why? Because I think the grammar of common good gives us the language that we need for talking about issues of power and cooperation, which arise whenever people are collaborating, including in these economic structures, including in our sort of most normal and most apparently free market exchange-based economic institutions. What the language of common good helps us to identify is what I think of as the moral architecture of a situation. So who owes what to whom? What are the different positions? It doesn't give us answers. I'm more interested in the question of grammar, how you formulate a question well. And so then maybe it's the people on the ground who need to give the answers. So what the grammar of common good alerts us to and points us to is that people who are cooperating with one another have a different set of responsibilities. They stand in a different moral relationship than people who are not. So the head coach of a team stands in a different position than the student manager of a team or someone who's not on the team. Likewise, the team captain has a different set of responsibilities than the first-year player or someone who's just aspiring to be on the team. And what is different about their positions is their different stance and place with respect to the common good. The reason they have the responsibilities or the powers that they have has to do with the common good of the whole team. And the idea of common good is trying to alert us to the things that go beyond their private interest or their personal interest to the communal aspects of the situation, which I think are essential for understanding it well. Now, where would we want to primarily use this sort of language of cooperation or the language of shared ends, which is what the common good is going to point us to? Now, a pretty natural place, if we were thinking about the economy, think about this, would be inside of the business firm. So in a business firm, I think it's fairly intuitive to say people are engaged in a kind of complicated cooperative project. There's all sorts of dense relationality. There are different sorts of friendships and enemies. There's traditions. There's power. There are contested visions of justice. To me, that seems just like what business firms are all about. And so the ethics of a firm, of acting well in a firm, is going to require some reference to the group as a whole and what it needs, and not just what the individuals need. So the ethics of a firm is fairly dense because of the density of the shared goals that people have there. On the other hand, all of that density and all that sociality, I think, is pretty much absent once you go outside of the four walls of the firm and out into the open market. On a market, what do we find? We find people more or less anonymous to one another, buying and selling in response to prices and supply and demand. And the ethics of the market, I don't think markets are an unethical place, but the ethics of the market is a lot more minimal. It just says, don't steal, respect people's property, perform your contracts, don't commit fraud, no false advertising, things like that. So it's not unethical, but it doesn't really appeal to any shared project because there just isn't one in view on a market. So what's driving the bus, so to speak, in market relationships is private interest and therefore coordinated by prices. In a firm, by contrast, and I think in any cooperative project, what's driving the bus is the shared goal or the common good as coordinated by power. So we have prices on the one hand and power on the other. But I think what Uber shows us or exemplifies for us is a puzzling situation where it's not clear if prices or power are in the driver's seat. There seems to be a mix of both. So it's not easy to say, again, is Uber just a matter of private exchange or is it a matter of people ordering other people around? It's just hard to say. I think the claims of justice and the moral structure of the situation is just pretty murky. But in this kind of, Uber looks to me like market-mediated power. And in this kind of difficult arrangement, I think we need a grammar of common action to sort out what's really going on. So we can ask questions about how to do the things that we're doing better, how to do them justly, how to do them well. Okay, now to focus in on Uber's problem. Uber has a lot of problems. It's got kind of a bad boy reputation. Their corporate strategy up to this point has included flouting local laws, more or less attempting to destroy their competition, strong-arm tactics, etc. But I want to leave those aside. The problem of Uber that I'm interested in is not the moral problems about how to be decent people, which arguably some people think they struggle, but the intellectual puzzle of what is the relationship of Uber to its drivers, which is where I began. Now, the real-world debate about this question basically boils down to two categories. Are Uber drivers, as I said, independent contractors or employees? Now, why is that the framing? We could ask ourselves that. That's the framing because that's the framing that the law gives us. The law has one category for independent contractors and a series of rights and duties that follow from that, and a separate category for employees, and a series of rights and duties that flow from that. So in countless countries where you have some kind of legal contestation, lawsuits, or Supreme Court rulings, you see different jurisdictions putting in Uber's drivers either in box A or box B, either as contractors or employees. Now, what are the pros, the advantages of being in one place or the other, in one box or the other, of seeing drivers as one thing or the other? To be an independent contractor is to buy into higher flexibility. There's little commitment and little long-term investment for a contractor in as opposed to an employee. So, I mean, classic cases of contractors. Imagine I own a software coding company and I have a problem with my roof. I hire a contractor to fix the roof. Now, I don't have a long-term commitment to this person. We can agree just for this deal, just for now, just for this price. So maybe tomorrow I'll hire someone else for a similar task for a different price, etc. So it's quite flexible because we're signing short-term, task-specific agreements. An employee, on the other hand, is less flexible, but it's more predictable. You know who's going to be, if you have an employee, you know who is going to be working for you because there's some kind of longer-term commitment. This is the salary for this period of time, or this is the rate of pay. So you can predict how much someone will be charging because you have agreed in advance for the kind of work that is done by an employee. Now, similarly, an independent contractor involves less commitment. So no one is committing. If you're signing a contract, you're not committing to sign a future contract tomorrow. You're just for this particular job. Now, on the other hand, the employment relationship involves greater allegiance. You have higher mutual commitment between the firm or the hirer and the person who's being hired. It says, I will stick with you through this, or I will do as you say, or there's a kind of loyalty that's being bought beyond what an independent contractor has. And it's a mutual thing. The company companies implicitly, at least, commit to sticking with their employees and doing well by them. Likewise, the employee implicitly commits to doing well by the firm, even if it's not written down in the contract. Independent contractors, if you're thinking about from the perspective of the hiring party, they have lower fixed costs. So Uber particularly wants its drivers to be independent contractors because, again, they don't have to pay for insurance. They don't have to pay for sick leave. They don't have to, and they let the drivers themselves own their cars. And so they're trying to lower their overhead as much as possible. So in essence, an independent contractor relationship is a distant, if not arm's length, at least more distant relationship, and an employee relation is a closer one. So there are lower fixed costs, and I don't have to pay for your things. I don't have to pay for your tools by comparison with the employment relationship, where I'm buying your greater allegiance at the cost of, I have to pay your Social Security and lots of other requirements. So what you don't get with an independent contractor relationship is control. So you don't have the right, because the person is not committing to you and is thinking short term, you haven't invested in them, the hiring party doesn't have the right to control the work or order around the person who is independent. This is what it means to say that they are independent. They are doing their own work, they're doing the things that I'm asking to do, but I don't get to order them around. They don't owe me any obedience. I don't have any meaningful control over them unless they agree to it. The employment relationship, on the other hand, you're buying all your higher costs do come at the benefit of this is that you have greater control. Why Uber originally opted for an independent contractor model was there's a loophole in the law that says that independent contractors do not have the right to collectively bargain. So the independent contractors generally have a smaller set of legal protections and legal rights by comparison with employees. But employees, again, as a sort of the price of greater control and of being more under the thumb of the employer, there's much tighter legal regulation of what companies are and are not allowed to do. Minimum wages, working conditions, other kinds of... So the employment relationship is regulated much more tightly than the contractor relationship. In part because we have a question of unequal power and control, which sort of calls forth government insurance or government intervention to make sure that this control is exercised justly. So why is it important to Uber to have their contractor or to have their drivers fall into the contractor bucket? Why do they invest so much money in keeping drivers classified as independent contractors? Well, it's essential to their business model. They're sort of the paradigm of tech disruption, and they would never have become the huge global company that they become if they had all the sort of close-in responsibilities of employment, with all the millions of drivers who drive for them around the world. Moreover, one of their main pitches is drive for Uber. It's flexible. You can do it when you want, as you want, suit your life. You don't have to commit us to 9 to 5 or drive for us all year, just for now, just today. So this allows Uber to be extremely light on the ground. So Uber provides a coordination tool, a digital tool, but physical assets, all of the physical things that were required in transport are owned by other people. So anywhere that their tool is acceptable or is adopted, and that's easy to get it adopted in many places, they can be making money without the larger investment of employment in persons and physical assets. Now, to be fair to Uber, Uber did not invent the idea of sort of using of coordinating transport through licensed independent contractors. Taxi cab companies, even going back 30, 40 years prior, before Uber ever existed, I think before its founder was even born, there was a strategy that was adopted in the 1970s precisely for this reason, that the independent contractors are not allowed to collectively bargain. Taxi companies realized that they could get outside from or get out from under some of their overhead, and so what they would, if their drivers were contractors. So although they had previously been salaried employees, taxis adopted a strategy of buying license medallions or taxi licenses from cities and then renting out their cars to drivers. So Uber has, so they had been doing this for 30 years before Uber arrived. So Uber simply extended the same logic further to have, even larger control, greater scalability with even fewer physical assets on the ground. But the same general idea as let's keep our drivers at arm's length was not an innovation of Uber's. And because those taxi drivers couldn't unionize, they didn't have the same level of benefits, and they were saving on costs there. Okay, so the legal debate comes down to whether drivers are or should be independent contractors or employees. How does this debate go? Judges apply a number of doctrinal tests to classify workers as employees, but one of them is called the ABC test. Now, A, I don't actually know what the acronym stands for, but A stands for control, basically whether or not the hiring party controls the work of the person who's hired. B, and if the more control there is, the more it looks like an employment relationship. B, whether they're operating in distinct lines of work. So if I'm a plumbing company and I hire a roofer, that's more likely to make him an independent contractor. But if I'm a plumbing company and I hire a plumber, that makes him look more like an employee. C, the question is whether the person hired operates an independent business. So if they're operating their own business apart from me, they look more like a contractor. And if not, they look more like an employee. Now, what is Uber's argument is on the matter of control, they say we don't control our drivers. They decide when they drive. They log in whenever they want. They log out whenever they want. And so we are not controlling their work. They're driving their own cars. They're not committing to us. We're not committing to them. This is an arm's length relationship. On the matter of what industry we're in, Uber argues that it is not a transportation company. It is a software company. So what Uber does is build an app, and what the drivers do is drive. So we have two distinct industries, just like the plumber and the roofer. So therefore, our drivers are not doing the same thing that we are doing. We are a bunch of programmers. They are driving. We're in separate industries, therefore they're contractors. And part of Uber's marketing pitch to drivers is that they offer turnkey entrepreneurship. So you can be your own boss with an Uber. It's easy. You sign up for the network, you meet a few minimal requirements, and you're your own CEO. Your company's making money. So they're allowing people to be their own company. Again, on the idea that what the people we're dealing with are themselves in business for themselves. Drivers, on the other hand, can make a counter case. They'd say, at least not all Uber's drivers want to be employees, but those who do would say, well, actually, you may say it's true that you don't control when we drive, but Uber controls nearly everything else about the experience. So the rates that are offered, when they're offered and how much they're offered is entirely set by Uber. And Uber does not simply let drivers drive however they want. They monitor sort of the driving characteristics. Are you speeding? Are your phone shaking? Are you texting while you're driving? Are you following the routes that the Uber app is suggesting? So this makes everything look more like employees. On the matter of on Uber's argument as to a software company versus a driving company, I think the easy response would be, well, Uber is a software company, but it's an app that's designed to enable driving. It's not simply any old software. This is a transport application. Therefore, Uber is in the transport industry, just like we, the drivers, are. And drivers who want to say that they're employees also would say, we don't really have separate businesses because our entire business is dependent on your apps. So it's not as though we have a separate transport business and you're just helping us out. We are entirely working through you, and so we're not really independent. So therefore, we should be classified as employees. So these are the kinds of questions that a judge would ask. And as you can see, or as I'm trying to show, an argument could be made on both sides, both from Uber's contractor perspective and the driver's employee perspective, as to which box the drivers are supposed to fall into. So they are unlike standard employees. They don't commit 9 to 5. They're not salaried. You can drive part-time, full-time as you want. That's the strongest thing, I think, in favor of Uber's case. The fact of oversight and dependence, I think, argues in favor of the driver's case. But on the whole, to me, it's the right answer would be that, or what seems most plausible to me is that neither shoe fits very well. It doesn't appear that Uber's drivers are employees in any clear sense, nor are they contractors in the clear sense. So, and Uber wants it this way. Uber has been looking and has found a kind of arrangement that has both, on the one hand, flexibility and control. So it's not a pure contracting relationship, and it's not a pure employment relationship. So it does fall and is meant to fall in between those two categories. But that means that the sort of legal ethic of employment versus the legal ethic of contracting does not apply to the situation. So I think if you were an employee, then there's a number of legal responsibilities you have. If you're a contractor, then there's a number of legal responsibilities that you have. Well, what if you're neither? The reality of the situation suggests to me that they're neither, that there's some kind of in-between category. But what are we supposed to say then about what is the right ethic for this situation? How do we understand the moral architecture of Uber and its drivers? Uber is genuinely doing something different than traditional firms and markets are doing, and that may be fine. But that doesn't mean they get to make up their own moral standards. So what should we say? I want to propose, again, something a bit more general. That what we need is a language of thinking about cooperation outside the categories of employment and contracting and that sort of thing. And this is what I would call the common action framework. Now, the big claim of my common action framework, or the big sort of ending claim, is that every form of common action, wherever people are cooperating together, they're oriented to some common good, which deserves their allegiance. So all common action is oriented towards common goods, and those common goods deserve the primary allegiance of the people who are engaged in the common action. So how does this framework work? Basically like so. So when people join in common action, and by this I mean cooperating under any sort of thing, I mean this could apply to, again, a team, a family, a firm, a club. People join in common action. This fact of common action creates an emergent social form or a social unity or just a community or an association. And that social form is itself oriented towards some kind of goal, some kind of common good, which is, generally speaking, to be understood just as being an excellent whatever it is. So you could broadly say we're trying to flourish in justice as a school. So the common good of a school is to be a great, flourishing, just school. The common good of a club is to be a great, flourishing, just club. But that larger goal, which is being an excellent school, then demands the primary allegiance of the members when they're acting as members. So to join in common action, you no longer are allowed to, morally speaking, simply consult your own interests or your private yield or whatever, but your private yield as a member of the group, or what you deserve in justice as a part of this group. Why? Because you're engaged in actions and you're receiving things from the group that are not just about you. So there's something beyond you. There is this densely social thing that is an order of common action, and its good is what demands your allegiance. Now, how is this different from sort of private exchange or some other kind of human interaction? Well, let me sort of go over some standard features of common action. I think the clearest contrast category for what is not common action is private exchange, and the paradigmatic thing being a market. So first of all, common action always implies some form of power or authority. So it's never the case that common action is simply a matter of voluntary agreement, and people do only and exactly what they want, and never have to obey something. Now, this power could be exercised by a person, it could be exercised by a constitution, by a law, by customs, but somehow there's some form of submitting to some kind of authoritative rule. This also raises the possibility in common action of abuse of power. Whereas if all you're doing is signing a contract, at least as an idealized thing, there's no power in a contract, and people do only what they've agreed to do. So there's no possibility of abuse. You also have questions of honor and status, people asking how much people matter, and whether some people are, taken to be more valuable within the common action or within the group than other people. If some people are taken to be more valuable, this opens the possibility of discrimination. Some people may be unjustly taken as less valuable. Whereas if people are simply signing contracts sort of at an arm's length, the possibility of honor and status doesn't arise, and the only things that they're interested in is not prestige or some social good, but stuff or some material good. In common action, there's this distinctive claim of justice that you can make, which are claims of distributive justice, which ask how much somebody deserves based on how much they're worth. By contrast, if you're just signing a contract, the kinds of justice you're going to invoke has to do with how much you own or what your rights are. I have a right over this thing. It's not that I deserve something, it's that I have a right to that. That's the classic justice of exchange. Then you have questions of friendship and solidarity and other kinds of specifically social goods and the kinds of specifically social vulnerabilities that those entail. So common action is not all just about positive things. It creates a set of liabilities or problems as well. But all of these are basically absent when you're dealing only with exchange. So if exchange among anonymous strangers doesn't involve any of the colored features I've stuck up here, but whenever there is common action, we can expect to see all of those things. So, and these are aspects of the situation that once you're engaged in common action, you can ignore these things only at the price of injustice. Because, at least I would argue, they're really operative, they're genuine concerns, and they're going to be there. And you could pretend that they're not there, but then you'll just be missing something of what's really going on. So the basic claim, again, of common action is if there is common action, then your orientation is to the common good, which involves some proper use of all of these things. Especially, we're talking about matters of authority. Those who are making authoritative decisions have to make them in light of the common action or the sort of the good of the group. Why are you a team captain? You're a team captain to promote the good of the team, not just that you can be on the highlight reel or some other kind of thing. Like otherwise, if there were no common action, you can promote your own private goods all you want, but in the context of common action, the common good trumps. This is the sort of moral claim that common action makes. Now, so where you find common action, you need to ask yourself questions like, is power being used in a way that's faithful to our shared goal or subversive of it? What kind of character are we encouraging? What sort of person are we promoting and what kind of person are we, putting down? Who matters? But these questions, again, don't exist and aren't appropriate to ask where there isn't common action. So if you think about the category we had, the narrower category of employment law considers, roughly speaking, these kind of things because employment is a form of common action. But this is a broader category as well. So, and that's why I think this common action framework is appropriate for asking about Uber because it includes not only dense hierarchical firms, but any kind of cooperation. So, with this common action language in mind, how could we retranslate the Uber problem? Again, the problem of Uber is not whether Uber has any employees, or whether there's common action in Silicon Valley among the drivers, among the software coders of Uber, but whether the drivers themselves are engaged in common action, or whether they make up some kind of large community along with Uber, because common action creates a community. So is it the case that Uber's drivers are engaged in common action, creating a community of some kind which is oriented to a common good, or not? So we could ask these are clues to whether there is common action or not. Is the thing being coordinated by power or by prices? Are people acting as members or just as anonymous strangers in a market? Is it primarily a matter of price-centered exchange or some denser form of common action? So this becomes, rather than asking about employment or versus contracting, we want to ask this sort of broader set of questions which are giving us clues to whether there is common action in Uber. And if there is, then we can apply the grammar of common goods and its moral standards. Okay, just how can we answer this question? So first question we want to ask, is there common action between Uber and its drivers? Again, I think if this question were easy, then the Uber problem would be an easy problem. I don't think it's so easy because there are some features of common action and there are some that are present and others that are absent. So are Uber's drivers and Uber aiming at some kind of common end? Or do we see the kind of characteristic forms of cooperation that you'd see in any other kind of organization? Well, it's hard to say. There's relatively little interaction between the drivers and Uber, or it's mediated by an algorithm, it's mediated by an app. Therefore, there's relatively little friendship or solidarity or mutual knowledge. On the other hand, I think it is plausible to say that they are engaged in a single project, which is giving people a ride. Uber provides the sort of coordination and the knowledge part. The other people provide the actual ride. And if you took either one away, these things would be truncated. They're not really intelligible one without the other. So it does look like there's a single kind of action and a single kind of goal. And even more noticeably, I think, the fact or presence of power and authority is something that always indicates or is a good clue that there is common action. And it does appear that in the case of Uber, there is a form of market power. Importantly, there is the fact of Uber's oversight. So Uber wants to control the way that its drivers drive to make sure that the Uber brand remains strong. They don't want to have Uber, you could be subverted if your drivers are not driving well enough. So Uber sets standards and it monitors and it enforces those standards. Standard setting is not a kind of contracting. Standard setting is an exercise of authority. And to the extent that Uber is doing that for its drivers and enforcing this, looks like a form of power. There's also a more classic form of market power, which is the fact that Uber is giant and these people are tiny. And so it looks like more like monopoly power. Though that's the kind of power that you could exercise without common action, properly speaking. So it looks to me, at least, although it's sort of problematic, that there is in fact a form of common action between Uber and its drivers, even though it's hard to say whether the goal is genuinely a common goal. So maybe what we have is a form of common action without common goals? To my mind, that's actually theoretically impossible, but perhaps there is a kind of incoherence here, and that's because what Uber is looking for is, to quote Spider-Man, almost power without responsibility. Uber wants to have its drivers close enough to control, but far enough to keep at arm's length and not have to take responsibility for them. And that's the problem. So the problem with Uber is not the particular kind of coordination they're doing. It's that they are exercising a kind of power without claiming any sort of fidelity to the common ends that might emerge. I'm not really sure what the community would be, but it does seem like there is a kind of community here, because if there, at least in my theory, if there's common action of some kind, there must be a community of some kind as well. Now, to ask a more overtly normative question, whether there is common action, what's the solution to the problem? Should there be? Is it good for there to be common action? Should there be more? Do we want Uber to become more like a genuine community or less? Well, I hesitate to answer this, in part because common goods or common action is not necessarily better than private goods. It's not better that everyone should seek common goods with everybody. The grammar of common goods, or the ethics of the common good, is kind of, at least as I think about it, it's kind of conditional. You want your goals or your understanding of what you're doing to match the social form. If it's common action, you should orient yourself to a common good. If not, then you don't have to, and you don't worry about it. And in fact, it's impossible to promote or secure a common good without common action. So what we want to make sure with Uber is that the goals or the normative structure matches the social reality. So this gives, and the problem, as I mentioned a second ago, is that Uber wants to have the social reality of cooperation, i.e. power and control, without any kind of allegiance to a common good. So that is a problem because there's a lack of fit. So there would be two solutions to this problem. Uber could either recognize that the drivers are engaged in some kind of common action and therefore deserve some sort of status in a group, therefore they're doing something more than merely contracting. And effectively, you then be paying for your control with larger responsibility or larger sensitivity to some common good. The other option is you could actually diminish the common action and take away the aspects of control and say, well, we don't want to share our goods with you. We're going to push you, make sure that you're outside the firm, but then they need to be genuinely outside the sort of power sphere of Uber. Now, to my mind, either of those would be above board, and I don't know which Uber ought to choose. But it seems to me that insofar as Uber and its drivers are engaged in a form of common action already, these are the only two options that are normatively available. If it's right that there is a form of common action, you can either go this way or this way. You can't have common action with private ends. And that's what Uber is trying to have. Sort of that's the core of Uber's problem. All right, stop there.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Do you feel comfortable moderating your own questions?
Whatever. Sure. Great. Yes.
I see this here, and I immediately am reminded of like Airbnb and the role that Airbnb plays in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Could you say this is like almost verbatim of that?
So I think what you want to look at, as I was trying to suggest with the common action framework, is you want to look at to what degree people are actually engaged in sort of doing something together. There are some online marketplaces, to my mind, that don't involve this. One that's very clear to me is eBay. eBay is just a platform where people sell whatever, and eBay barely controls anything about what you sell, what you market, whatever. Uber is way more involved with what the people are actually doing, and that's kind of their issue. Now, you'd have to ask a question with Airbnb, something like, to what degree does Airbnb, is it just in kind of a neutral platform? Or are they really sculpting what the houses are that are being offered and how they're offered and sort of helping people market? And the more you're doing that, and the more it looks like you're engaged in common action. I'm comfortable with the idea that you could have an online marketplace that just sort of says, we're just a middleman, we are really just helping you contract with people, which is what Uber is not doing. But Airbnb, I think, might be. We have to know more about the actual relationships among the people there.
Thank you.
So you mentioned how it would seem impossible to have common action without common goal.
Right.
And maybe under, this fairly technical framework, I was interested in, like, when I first was reading about the talk, common good, I was like, people thought that was an incoherent idea. But I think under your definition, I'm willing to assent to, like this structural version of it. As far as like a common goal goes, that's consistent among drivers and Ubers, obviously profit seeking. You just have the drivers in Uber at odds over, like, who's getting the profit, right? And that's not an uncommon, no pun intended, that's not an uncommon phenomenon in an employee-employer relationship writ large.
Right.
And so, like, if we're trying to figure out what sort of relationship they hold, I guess we could just default to, it's like, look, they're all seeking profit. It's not like their life's dream is to give rides to people. That's just the best, again, no pun intended, the best vehicle for them to make their money.
Nice work.
So,
No,
like, really not intended, like it just kept happening.
Well, you're a font of double entendre. That's wonderful. Natural talent. No, I think there's profit as such. I think can fall under. It could either be a common good or it's not. It really depends on what people are doing to seek it. So the fact that you're seeking profit and that I'm seeking profit, it's only a common good if we're basically seeking it together. So you could say, if we're having a competitive relationship, like for every dollar you use or you win, I get one less, this probably looks less like a common good because we're not dividing anything, we're not securing anything together. You could say Uber and its competitors are all seeking they have a common good, namely profit, but they're not seeking it together. So it's not actually common. They're just seeking the same kind of good. So we could ask, are Uber's drivers and Uber seeking literally the same profit? Maybe it's more plausible with Uber. Then you sort of have to ask these sorts of, is it genuinely a common goal of theirs? I think people can join in a community and make profit a common end. But then you'd have to. I think it only really counts as a common end if you can apply some of the thinking to it that I was saying. So if you can ask a question like, who deserves this profit? Like, we made money from this cooperation. Do you deserve X or not? Is there some form of authority that's deciding how the distribution goes, or is it we antecedently signed a contract that you'd get 20% and I got 30%? That makes it look less like a genuine common good. Like, we don't have to debate about it. There's no question of justice after the fact. Then it's just I think you can have convergent private goods, like your profit and my profit are somehow interdependent, but that doesn't quite make them a common good. If the whole scheme doesn't include some of the other stuff that I was talking about. I don't know if that's properly answering your question, but.
No, it does. That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the framing that you are using in this talk, because when you talk about common goods, community, those words are often used to refer to like nonprofit organizations, what they are doing.
Right.
And the common goods are for the consumers in this case.
Right.
Uber's business model basically just follows the capitalist model, right? It follows all the capitalism wants to profit. And when you talk about common goods, to me it sounds like the common goods or common benefits, mutual benefits between Uber and the drivers, but not about the consumers. So it's a little bit unclear to me that when you talk about community, you are talking about the community between Uber, the company, and the drivers, but you are not talking about the larger, broader societal impact and the members in the larger society, if I am hearing you.
You are hearing me correctly. Yes, exactly. So I think that the question of common good can be pitched at pretty much any level you want. Any scope of community, I think you can apply the logic of common goods. So I've been asking about Uber and its drivers, whether they form their own kind of community. And to me, you can pretty much identify whether they have common action and a lot of things about it without asking about anybody else. So I think people often use the term common good to refer to the political community or just the community, whatever that means. And so you want something to be good for everybody. And that's what would make it a common good, and everyone somehow shares in it. To my mind, I'm sort of deflationary and skeptical about that kind of thing. I think you can ask that question, but the concept of common good doesn't require you to ask that. And so the fact that we can talk about this without referring to consumers. We could also say, how does this whole gig economy thing or Uber's thing affect the various communities that they're a part of? And then we're going to ask a different set of who matters, what kind of justice is applicable here, what are our shared goals? Because our goal, if we're a local municipality, we have a different shared goal, a different social form than they do. That doesn't mean they're unrelated, and we would want, I guess the Aristotle way of sort of dealing with this is the higher forms somehow take in or coordinate the lower ones. So you ought to be able to ask about if it were genuinely a common good, maybe you both want to make sure that Uber is treating its drivers well and that all of them are treating the other consumers well. But that's a separate question, and that's a different community that has a different goal and a different structure. So you can ask that question in common good language too, and I think you should be able to. But that's not common good doesn't make you, or I don't think it should make you necessarily think about that big question. You can also look at it in the small, because it's more of a logic of how the things work. And I think we find that logic in lots of standard capitalist institutions. That's sort of a big argument I'm making here. Is we may think about there's just a bunch of competitive private exchange here, and all the common good stuff happens in politics or in the nonprofit sector. That's wrong, I think. So if you won't understand our institutions if you can't also apply this kind of logic to them. Yeah, our economic institutions. Yeah.
If I were a judge, how would you instruct me to begin ruling to protect this special third thing or this compromise between these two positions? Like, how would I apply this to legal decision making going forward?
Well, I think you'd have two solutions. One solution is go to your friends in the legislature and have them pass new laws so that there's another category that you can apply. Because I do think that the legal categories don't apply very well. Another thing you can do, and what actual judges have done, is you see, well, what we're trying, there are certain common goods and sort of social benefits, and we know that the law already does, even though it doesn't have a great category for what Uber's drivers are like, we do know how to protect these kind of goods. So you could say, like, give you more potential for unionization, or somehow like create works councils, or some way that these sorts of communal or solidary goods are typically promoted. You could ask for more regulation without a clear legal category. I don't think you can make you can't make it very. You couldn't say, well, this is where you go. But judges kind of have to construct another category by adding some things like, well, we're trying to protect you from the power of Uber, and we know how to do that a bit by doing this various kinds of things. So, I mean, mostly what has happened when people want to protect the drivers is to say that they are employees. But I just don't think that kind of just, I mean, we could, that will seriously alter Uber's business model, which may itself be a good thing to do. But if you wanted to just sort of track what's already going on, you could sort of cobble together various solutions for protecting workers or empowering them within a community.
Any more questions? Awesome. So shall we thank Mark once more? Thank you very much.